Hello, Massabesic. How are you today? I'm glad to be able to join you, if only electronically, and talk a little bit about climate change, Keystone pipeline, and really about science itself. I want to thank the students that wrote into my office with questions about climate change and questions about Keystone. I want to thank Mr. Parent for working with these young people to educate them about these issues and the science involved. I think the first thing I want to say is that quite often we get involved in these kinds of issues, and the place I like to start is with the facts. Don't start with the emotion and those kinds of things, but start with the science and the facts. And I think on climate, what's really convinced me is the data and the science that's been built up over the last few years. I carry around with me in my pocket here at the Senate a little card that really is, I call it climate change in a nutshell. And on one side of the card is the CO2, carbon dioxide, concentration in the atmosphere over 1 million years. It's based on records that are going back 1 million years, and they can test the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from so long ago by little bubbles of air that are caught in ancient ice cores. Ice will hold these little bubbles. They can tell how far back they are. They can measure how much CO2. So you can see how CO2 has been in the atmosphere over a long period of time. And what the card shows is that for the last 999,000 years, pretty much, CO2 has bounced around in the atmosphere between 180 and, say, 300 parts per million. So for 1 million parts of air, between 180 and 300 are carbon dioxide. That was true, and it went up and down as times changed and as events changed on the Earth. But then around 1850, 1860, when the so-called Industrial Revolution really got going and we started burning oil and coal in large quantities, you can see on the card that the CO2 in the atmosphere just went almost straight up, to the point where now it's at 400 parts per million. It hasn't been above 300 or much above 300 for over 1 million years, and now we're all of a sudden at 400 parts per million, and that has an impact on our planet. So to me, this first chart of CO2 in the atmosphere answers 2 of the 3 questions about climate change. The first is something happening? And this data makes it completely clear that it is, that something new and different has happened that has changed the planet's atmosphere to something it hasn't seen in millions of years. The second question is, do people have anything to do with this? Some people say, well, it's a big planet and what people do just, really doesn't matter. Well, the truth is, it's a mighty big coincidence that this number started to go up so clearly and dramatically at the same time that we started burning fossil fuels in such large quantities, because when you burn fossil fuels, you release carbon dioxide, CO2, and there are millions of tons of carbon dioxide in the air, in the atmosphere now that weren't there even 100 years ago. So the first 2 questions, is something happening? Yes. Do people have something to do with it? Yes. The third question is, so what? What difference does it make? Carbon dioxide is invisible. It's just part of the air. It's always been there. If it's going up in amount, why does that matter? And that's when you get to the other side of the little card, which basically is 1 million years of data, of information, of science about the relationship between CO2 in the atmosphere and temperature. And what this shows is an almost exact overlap. It goes up and down and changes, but as CO2 goes up, so does average temperature in the world go up. And that's where we are today. 2014, the year just passed, was the warmest year on record. The last decade is the warmest decade on record. The decade before that was the warmest decade on record, and so on back for the last 30 years. So it's very hard to argue that nothing much is happening. Now, here in Maine, we're saying, well, this is really, it's one of the coldest winters we've ever had. We've had so much snow. What are you talking about, Senator? Obviously, there's no problem with the planet getting warmer. Well, you can't discuss this in terms of one place, one small place, one storm or series of storms. It's really a question of the whole planet and looking at the totality of the situation. Just, for example, this winter, as we've had so much snow in Maine, in the West, in California, I just talked to a world-class snowboarder, Jeremy Jones in California. They have practically no snow this winter, way less than they ever have before. So it's an uneven kind of impact across the globe, but the bottom line is larger storms, different kind of storms, droughts in some places, too much rain in other places, hurricanes, and the evidence, the scientific evidence is really overwhelming that something serious is happening. So the question then is, what do we do about it? And we really have to figure out ways that we burn less fossil fuel. It's really pretty simple. We just have to stop burning stuff and putting so much into the air. There are lots of ways to deal with that. One is to conserve energy. If just to weatherize your home, for example, storm windows, caulking in the windows and doors, just saving energy means there's less fossil fuel to go up into the air. So conservation and higher mileage cars, for example, are a great way to take a bite out of climate change. And then shifting to other forms of energy. For example, natural gas, which we now use a lot of in Maine, particularly in southern Maine, is much cleaner than oil or coal. It produces about half of the CO2 into the atmosphere per unit of energy than coal or oil. So switching fuels to be cleaner, more efficient is one of the answers. Another answer is to get our power from what they call renewables, which means things that grow back. Fossil fuel is carbon that's trapped in the earth that's been there for millions of years, literally from fossils, from plant material, dinosaurs that have been in the ground, and we're pulling it out in the form of oil, coal, and natural gas. But renewables are things like wind. The wind keeps blowing. Solar energy is a huge potential source of energy. The sun shines down every day and provides energy to our planet. We're now working on technologies to make energy from the waves in the ocean, from the tides that go in and out in the ocean. And of course in Maine, historically, we've had renewable energy for 100+ years from hydroelectric power, dams on our rivers that make electricity as the water falls. So there's no one single solution. There's no simple answer to this, but it's a combination of things, of conservation, using less energy, and looking at ways to produce that energy in ways that don't produce carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is something that I feel very strongly about because I'm trying to do something for you. You are the group, you young people are going to have to cope with the effects of this all of your lives. And to the extent we can work on it now and try to slow down the carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere and other chemicals, by the way, then you're going to have an easier time dealing with it. Otherwise, you're going to have to pay the bill for building up our coastal communities, for repairing damage after storms, and for dealing with the consequences of climate change around the world. The way I look at a problem like this is really pretty simple. I call it the Maine rototiller rule. I'm guessing that most of you know what a rototiller is. It's a machine you use in the spring and the summer. It's sort of like, looks like a snowblower, only instead of a snowblower, it has these big forks on it, and it turns the earth over. It's for preparing your garden in the spring and summer. Well, to me, the Maine rototiller rule is pretty simple. If you borrow your neighbor's rototiller, you want to give it back to them in as good shape as they gave it to you with a full tank of gas. That's sort of a basic principle of neighborliness in Maine that we understand. I think it applies to the planet. We have the planet on loan. We don't own it. We own little pieces of it, but we have it on loan from the next generation, from your generation and your children and your grandchildren. And I think we have a common sense responsibility to pass the planet on to the future of our world, our children and grandchildren, and on into the future, in as good or better shape than we found it. And one way that we're going to do that right now, 2015, in Maine, in America, and across the world, is to realize the consequences of what we're doing, the consequences of what's going on in the atmosphere, and start to take real steps to do something about it, to make a better world for you and for all of your neighbors and friends and for kids like you all over the world. So I just want to thank you for joining me for a few minutes here today to compliment you on concerns about this. Oh, and I just realized you wanted me to talk a bit about the Keystone pipeline. I'll do that for just a minute before concluding. I voted against the Keystone pipeline because for several reasons. One, when I dug into it, again, the way to make decisions is to get the facts. And when I dug into the facts, I became realized more and more that it really wouldn't benefit this country very much. A lot of talk about jobs. It wasn't going to produce all that many jobs. The oil, a lot of the oil would go right through the United States and then be exported overseas, so it wouldn't really do much for oil availability or gasoline here in the country or gasoline prices. And the more I dug into it, the less sense it made as a benefit to the U.S. On the other hand, the pipeline presents risks in terms of a breach of the pipeline, what it would do if it was near an aquifer or a river or a lake, and the damage that it would cause, so there was a risk. But also fundamentally, I just thought the pipeline was looking in the wrong direction. Instead of looking to build a huge project that would make it easier to develop a pretty dirty oil source up in Canada, why shouldn't we be thinking about an energy policy that moved us away from fossil fuels? And we can't do it overnight, I know that. But to move us away from fossil fuels toward a clean energy future that will create more jobs in this country and will also create a better future for all of us. So that's a little background on climate change, why I think it's so important, in Maine, and why I hope you will continue to work with me as we try to make a difference for yourselves and for the future of Maine and the United States. Thanks for your time, and glad to be with you.